Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Today, I'm thrilled to welcome someone who I've known for a while. She's had an incredibly varied career, which we'll discuss. Among the positions she's held include the former director of PJ Arway for PJ Library, as well as director of author and illustrator stewardship. She's lectured widely on various topics ranging from Maimonides to Jewish peoplehood. And most importantly to me, I consider her a friend. Please help me welcome Catriella Freedman. Catriella, thanks so much for joining me.
Wow, Jonathan, thank you for that introduction.
Well, I want to start with
you.
well, I want to start with a little bit. We talked a little bit beforehand. I wanted to see how things are doing in general for you, because you're in Israel and it's constantly being attacked right now. So what's going on there and how are you doing?
It's relentless. I've never experienced anything like this in my life. I was too young during the I was really, really little during the Yom Kippur War.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that people who were adults at the time and fighting at the time, or here in Israel, here in the US, talked about it in the same way that people talk about this period of time in terms of an existential threat on so many levels.
Right.
And since then, thankfully, Israel as a military state is in a much better position to protect itself. But it's constant bombardment. I don't think, I'm very in touch with my family in the US and friends in the US, even people who try to follow what's happening. Even us here, we don't know the full extent of everything that's happening on a daily basis. So one of the things that really frightens me, for instance, is how everybody knows that things are escalating on the northern border. What they don't realize is how far-reaching Hezbollah has gotten in terms of shooting missiles and what we call suicide drones. And they're going as far south as Haifa. I live in Zichron Yaakov. We're just south of Haifa. And it's really, they're just encroaching further and further with these suicide drones that are much more difficult to detect. The other thing that's happening is that right now, I think that the temperature in general around the world I don't know what it's like for you, Jonathan, in Florida, but the temperature is really, really hot. Like it's,
that I've seen, yeah.
Yeah, we have a heat wave going on. It dissipated for a bit and then it came back in full force. It's going to be a hot summer. And the problem, of course, in Israel is that when it gets hot, it gets really, really dry. Even despite the humidity, it's just a dry country, Middle Eastern country, and the desert is always encroaching. And so what's happening is that these suicide drone missiles are causing forest fires and crop fires. And the extent of damage is hard to understand because most Jewish Israelis have been evacuated from the northern border. Arab Israelis and Druze that live on the northern border, some of them have refused to be evacuated. And last week we had a terrible situation with 11 citizens who were killed in a Hezbollah attack on the northern border. 10 of them were Israeli Arabs who had not evacuated, and one of them was an IDF soldier who was attacked so you don't see a lot of numbers. Whatever it is, it's always terrible, but you don't see the huge numbers that you would if those areas had not been evacuated. What you aren't hearing is the fact that so many of the people who have been evacuated have been living without jobs, have been living with their kids in a completely different school system. It sounds fun to live in a hotel. It doesn't sound fun to live in a hotel after so many months. And cramped and just not being where you belong. And the thing that they all talk about is the fact that they don't have houses to go back to. Infrastructure has been damaged, homes have been damaged. So it's frightening, that northern Israel has basically become a buffer zone.
I've seen that. I've seen the videos of the fires and they're horrific, and no one ever mentions that. No one ever mentions the constant barrage that is coming from the north.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And the further complication I think, Jonathan, that you hear about is that because you're actually checking these things on a regular basis, is that the complication with a fire on the border is
Mhm.
that how would you usually fight a
Right,
fire is with planes and trucks and water supplies. Well, the northern border is really unsafe right now
right.
because they can't fly the fire planes because they'll get shot down by Hezbollah, and they can't let the fire department come so close to where they could get shot at by Hezbollah. So it's just it's sort of a really terrible situation. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about the IDF going further into Lebanon,
I've read
because
that.
it's just a
Yes.
situation that's not been, there's no resolution on a diplomatic side. So
No, they won't. They can't be.
yeah.
Well, let's go. Let's go to you. So one of the things that I find fun about doing this is that when doing research, I get to learn so many different things about you that I didn't know. So I'm glad we're able to discuss. So you grew up in California?
Yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles. I was born in Los Angeles and I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. So I was one of the original Valley girls. You could see the Sherman Oaks Galleria from my house.
I have trouble thinking of you talking that way in the Valley Girl speak, but
Oh my God, like gag me with a spoon. It's like second nature.
I'd have to hear that. So, were you religious growing up? Or, I mean, always involved in Jewish things?
That's a really interesting question, Jonathan. So we were always very traditional. My parents came from very interesting background. My father actually grew up in Israel. He was born in Palestine. His birth certificate,
Says that,
um,
right?
his birth certificate says Palestine, and that he was born to a Jewess in 1928. And he grew up in a Hasidic family,
Oh, wow.
actually on the northern border.
Hmm.
Uh, and they were the only observant slash Hasidic family where they grew up in a place called Yisod Mala, which for people who are listening, it's right near Mishmar HaYarden. It's very close to the Syrian border and to the Golan Heights.
Hmm.
Uh, and or Ayelet HaShachar is a famous kibbutz that's right there. And he always felt very uncomfortable. They were really, really poor, like no outhouse poor. But the one thing that they did have is they always had food. It wasn't like uh, that time in the 30s in Jerusalem was a particularly bad place
Hmm.
to be young. There was a lot of malnutrition going on and a lot of very little access to fresh vegetables and fruits. He grew up in a place where there was always fresh vegetables, always fruits. He never was hungry. They were just poor. They didn't have running water. And it was really, really basic kind of existence. And he never felt comfortable in the fact that he was observant. All his friends, all his buddies were playing soccer all day on Shabbat, and nobody would ever go into the synagogue. And he didn't want that life for himself, he thought. And so when he was young enough, when he was old enough, he actually was during the British Mandate, and he was recruited into the British Army
Oh, wow.
uh, in Palestine, and he would steal weapons for the Haganah, for
Hmm.
the proto IDF.
Right, right.
And then eventually, when war broke out in 1948, he fought in the Independence War. He fought up there where he was from. Uh, and after the war was over, he always dreamed about going to America. He was working for a shipping company called Zim, which is a famous Israeli shipping company. And he met my mother in New York. And my mother was on her way to Israel, actually to
Oh,
Zichron
funny.
Yaakov, where I live now, because she always wanted to make Aliyah. And she was from, this is in the 1950s. She was from Vienna, and her family, her family managed to help her escape when she was 5 years old after the Anschluss, after the Nazis took
Hmm.
over Vienna. She came on her own with 50 other children to America, to Philadelphia, was adopted by family members, and then eventually her parents survived
Oh, wow.
the Holocaust and everything, and they caught up with each other in Brooklyn. So
Where
she was
else?
brought up. She was brought up as a socialist.
Hmm.
Uh, but the synagogue they wouldn't go to was Orthodox. And my father had this other background where by the time he joined the army, he had left all observance. You know, he was very secular, but always had that background. By the
Hmm.
time I came around, I came late in their lives, late-ish in their lives. By the time I came around, they were fed up with the public school education that my sisters had had, and they wanted me to have a more kind of focused education, an education. The public school system where my sisters were getting educated was not great. And so the only place that would accept me, meaning without having to pay a lot of tuition, was an Orthodox day school.
Hmm. That you
So
wound up.
they sent me to an Orthodox day school, and I kind of, from there I became much more observant, and eventually they followed suit as well.
It's funny because I went to yeshiva also as a kid, and it was not necessarily that my parents were observant to that degree. They weren't. But it's just that they wanted me to have that education to go
Exactly.
right.
That's exactly what it was. I remember I thought I always, when I was, I moved to this school when I was in third grade, but when I was younger than that, I thought that we were really Jewish. We were really Jewish, but I
Hmm.
thought, wow, we're like, I don't know. I didn't know what I was. I thought we were like Hasidic, because we actually always had a kosher kitchen because
Us too.
my father had
Yeah,
so many religious family. The idea was in case they come, we only
same
got
thing.
kosher meat, things like that. We always said kiddush on Friday night. And I remember my first day at this Jewish day school in the San Fernando Valley, uh, in third grade, the teacher said, let's go through the things you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And I knew you weren't allowed to write. That was something that my dad had told me I can't do. I can't write. I don't know why. I probably was bugging him about something. And he said, you can't write on Shabbat. And so I raised my hand and someone said, you can't write. And I put my hand down. I thought that was the answer. And then everybody had their hands up for like another 30 minutes talking about all these things. And I thought, wow, and I felt like betrayed by my family. I couldn't believe they never told me about all these
All the
things
other things.
I could do. And from then on, I was in third grade and I would stay in my room in the dark on Friday night. I refused to come out, and they had to cajole me to come out for
Oh,
dinner. And that was, I was like, why didn't you tell me all these things? And I was crazy.
so considering what you did later, I'm also curious. Now, were you a big reader growing up?
I have to admit, I was a big reader, but I've never been a fast reader.
Hmm.
And whenever I was hiring people for book selection for PJ Our Way, I always look for people who are fast readers and could read
You get to,
things faster than I can.
who are some of your favorite authors growing up?
Jonathan Rosen.
Of
Oh,
course.
growing up. So I didn't read a lot of children's books. I because my parents, like I said, they had me at a later age, and my mother was a big reader. My mother was really, really a big reader, and so the books that I grew up with were like Herman Wouk. I was reading Philip Roth at a young age, Bernard Malamud. Like I grew up with a lot of these Jewish American authors. Uh, you know, I read All of a Kind Family, and I did
Hmm.
like it a lot. But in terms of just regular books, I loved Little House on the Prairie, of
Okay.
course. That was a big deal for me. And I'm trying to think of other series of books that really caught on for me. I loved A Separate Piece. Anything that had to do with like a school where things go haywire. I kind of like that.
I read. I was always a mix of kids' books and adult books. I read a lot of adult books as a kid as well. So it's the same, and many Jewish content books as well. So here's one of the things that I found fascinating. So you went to Princeton for your bachelor's, and then Harvard for your master's, both in Jewish studies. First of all, like Princeton and Harvard. I mean, had you always intended to work in a Jewish organization afterwards?
No, in fact, when I was at Princeton, I didn't actually major in Jewish studies. They didn't have a Jewish studies degree. What happened is my first 2 years, my freshman and my sophomore year, I had no idea what I wanted to major in. And I was just, I was so unfocused. And then I took a year off and went to Israel to study. I ended up studying at Midrashet Lindenbaum in used to be called Bravenders in Jerusalem. And that was the first time that I learned Talmud, because the high school that I went to was an all-girls school, and they were pretty right-wing, not very progressive. And even though there were schools at the time, that Orthodox schools where women could learn Talmud, that wasn't what I was exposed to. And it was the first time I was learning Talmud, and it really clicked with me.
You really had an interest in that?
Yeah, really did. And just the form of study there, in terms of really focusing on text, really ignited a huge curiosity and interest for me. So that when I got back to Princeton, I ended up majoring in religion. And within the religion department, they had a philosophy of religion specialty, and that's what I focused on. And I studied with, he's still around, he's fantastic. Some of you may have heard of him, Anthony Grafton, who is Jewish. He's one of the most well-respected intellectual historians in the country. And he was my professor, and I loved taking seminars with him. He was in the history department, and I convinced him that I would write my senior thesis about Maharal of Prague. It had nothing to do with golems. It was just the philosophy of Maharal. And because Maharal, even though the Renaissance had not really gotten to Prague, Anthony Grafton was interested enough in 16th century anything that he was willing to be my advisor. And we had a great relationship. We worked together for a year, and I wrote this thesis, and I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to become a Jewish studies professor. That's what I wanted to do.
Right.
So
I'm just curious now. Okay, so you went to Princeton and Harvard. So having experienced life there, then what goes through your mind now when you see what they become? Like when you see the rampant Jew hate by them and other campuses like those?
Shocked, but not surprised. It's really, I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. When I was in school, and I know I'm dating myself, yes or no, the biggest, that I was really involved with the Hillel, of course. And I think my junior year at Princeton, a student organization invited, I can't remember his name. His name just flew out of my head, but he was someone who was very close to Louis Farrakhan.
Okay.
Someone who had spoken.
Speaking of Jew hate, yes.
Stokely Carmichael. And he changed his name to a Nation of Islam name. So he was originally Stokely Carmichael. And he had gone to other campuses and had talked about, I actually went, many of us went to his speech. And that was the first time I ever, I came from such a bubble, coming from the San Fernando Valley. And I went to these Jewish schools and had this kind of idyllic LA upbringing, very safe. I never had anything anti-Semitic happen to me, not that I knew of. And at Princeton, everything was very, like we kind of, I was part of the Jewish groups, and we kind of had our own little, I felt like I was in my own little bubble. I wasn't really aware of other things that were happening around me. And they invited this gentleman to speak, and he got up, and we were just, we had heard all these rumors about the kinds of things he would say. And someone asked him, what do you do about the Zionists? And he said, get rid of them. And they said, well, how? And he said, by any means possible. And then people who I'd gone to school with for already 2.5 years started to chant, by any means possible. And I had this feeling of, like, I felt like ice, like everything in my blood turned to ice. It just felt like like I'd been confronted by dementors. Really, really frightening. And then the days afterwards, there was a very, very small group of students who were part of Nation of Islam, and they marched like Nazis around the school, with different slogans and things like that. That was my first confrontation, and it felt like, at the time, Harold Shapiro was the president, very Jewish guy, president of Princeton, a lot of Jewish professors, more Jewish students there. They said that when I was there, it was 13%, which for a really waspy school like Princeton, that was quite a lot. It was a small school to begin with. Everybody walked around with kippot. Nobody felt unsafe. And then there was this moment where things you could just see where things could go.
I think my first, I went to Brooklyn College, and it's just become terrible. It's amazing, and that's like right, in the heart of New York. But I think right now, when you're talking about bubble burst, I think the bubble has burst for a lot of people right now. That it can't happen. Oh, it's not. Everyone's safe here, and that's not necessarily the case. And I always talk about how I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. I always talk about that I'm not a fighter. I've been in many fights, though, and just about every time, because I'm Jewish. It's something, you have to, and I was always hoping that my kids would never experience that, and now that bubble has burst also. They see what can be around the world like that. So yeah,
I also saw it increase. Like, again, like that was this one incident, and it kind of died away. Like a lot of things do on college campuses, there's a lot of tumult, and then it kind of dissipates and it dies away. But all of a sudden, I was awakened to the fact that this exists. And then afterwards, especially after we were married, especially in Boston, by the way, this really didn't happen in New Jersey, but I had anti-Semitic incidents. And my father, who was, walked to synagogue every single Shabbat without any incident for, 70 years, 60 years, towards the end of his life, before he moved back to Israel to be near us, he got attacked for being Jewish on a Shabbat.
Awful.
This was like 6 years ago, 7 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's absolutely awful. Yeah, no, it's like I said, unfortunately, it's something, many people have experienced, like I said, I've experienced that. So let's go back to you a little bit. We'll come back to. So here's another thing that I had no idea about. So you were an associate producer on an award-winning documentary narrated by William F. Buckley. So how did that come about, and what was that like for you?
Wow, where's this information about me? Can't keep anything secret. So I had been doing a PhD in Jewish studies, and my advisor died. I know it sounds crazy, but it's not even something to laugh about. But and I felt really, I was almost done with it. I wasn't even that close to being done, but I felt like I had to take a break. And I was always interested in radio and like I felt like I had a good radio voice. And I had worked for a summer for Science Friday and for NPR, and really loved it. And I just was looking for something different. Nothing to do with Jewish studies, nothing to do with academics. I didn't want to read any books. And so I ended up connecting with a woman named Lori Conway, who was a producer. She produced documentaries, and she had gone to Harvard for her master's in journalism, I think. And so we connected through some sort of alumni network. And she hired me I started out as her assistant, and I ended up being an assistant producer on this documentary about John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist. And he still lived in Cambridge. I went to his house. I met him and his housekeeper from India, who came with the family wherever they went for years and years, because he had been the US ambassador to India for John F. Kennedy. And I believe Julia Child was still alive. And like I got to go to her house because she was his neighbor. Wow. It was fantastic. And then the more and more I worked on the documentary, the more involved I got. And John Kenneth Galbraith was extremely progressive, left-wing in his economics, and William F. Buckley is, as you know, was the opposite, but they were friends. And so it felt
this
like
is in the days when people could be friends.
exactly.
Right.
Well, they would go skiing in Gstaad together in Switzerland. So, they were basically the same person, just with different political views. And so I got to be a part of recording William F. Buckley narrating the documentary, and we recorded him in New York City at I believe it was at the New York Public Library, the New York Public Library. We used a room there to record him, and it was fantastic. He was so dry and so funny, and it was really like, he kept getting mad at me because I was doing the what do you call it, the teleprompter for him. And he kept saying, Catriella, it's too fast. Catriella, it's too slow. And I was getting so nervous. I was, in my early 20s. It was very nerve-wracking, but it was quite an experience to have known both of them.
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
It was amazing.
I was stunned when I said, like, wow. She has a lot of good stuff that she never talks about.
It was just one of those experiences that really changed my life.
Well, as I said as I mentioned at the beginning, so you've done a lot of lecturing besides Maimonides. What were some of the other topics that you do speak on or spoke on?
Well, a big topic that I used to speak on more, and I don't feel as skilled on speaking about it as much. I think there are people who are better suited for it than I was. Is Jewish peoplehood and kind of what I spent almost 2 years working at the International School of Jewish Peoplehood Studies, which was part of Beit HaTfutzot, the museum in Tel Aviv. Now it's called the Anu Museum. It's the Museum of the Jewish People. And that was what we did, is we would develop programming and lectures and training. Yeah, training for people about Jewish peoplehood. And I really enjoyed doing that. And you kind of, you would take any group of people visiting Israel and just ask sort of, what's your connection to Judaism? What's your connection to Israel? And you would find, no matter what people said, it would always fall into sort of 6 categories, of, either language, culture, religion. And you would do this exercise with people where they would see how much more they have in common than not in common. And it was a nice way to kind of bring groups together. And then I got deeper into the academic side of that. But really what I most enjoy teaching and most enjoy researching is just going deeper into Jewish texts and seeing how what I love looking at, for instance, you and many people who are listening to this have probably heard of Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers. It's translated as. It's a book that has a lot of wisdom. People look at it as wisdom literature or a morality text. Like who's considered wealthy, the person who's satisfied with what they have, that kind of thing. Like the big names like Rabbi Akiva and Hillel and Shammai, they're all over Pirkei Avot. And when you study it as a kid or even as an adult, it's really it's really one of the only wisdom texts we have in Judaism. But what I like to do with it and the way that I teach it is very influenced by Rabbi Benny Lau, who's here in Jerusalem, which is to look at it as actually a historical text and to look at it as a sociological text where you take the statements and instead of trying to say, yeah, how can I be a better person, which is always great, look at it and say, well, why did someone say this at that specific time? What was going on in that person's life and in that person's culture? What was going on in Israel when that person said, be aware of politicians, stay away from politics? Well, what was going on to make that person say that? And that's what I like to do, is kind of look at the context and the history. And that's what gets me excited.
Now, before you did that, one of the things that also struck me with you were a principal in a school also?
Yeah.
So, what was that like for you? I can't even imagine that with you, really.
I loved it, actually. I loved it. It was, it was right before we ended up moving to Israel. We were living in Albany, and it was a really, really nice community. It wasn't a community that we ever thought we could stay in for a long time, but it was one of these communities that kind of just managed to overlook denominational differences. I've
Mhm.
never been in another North American community, at least, that's like this, where every year on Rosh Hashanah, both Reform temples, both conservative synagogues, the Orthodox synagogue and the Chabad synagogue would get together on Rosh Hashanah. Everybody would get together at this pond, blow shofar together, and do tashlich together. And
Yes.
hundreds of Jews would, many would walk, many would drive, some would bicycle, some would jog. Everybody ended up in the same place. And it was a really, really nice community from that point of view. One of the reasons it could be like that is because it was also really small and everybody depended on each other. So that's where
Mhm.
I was principal of that day school. And
It was an
uh,
elementary school, so was it for younger kids?
it was from kindergarten through 8th grade.
Mhm.
And there are a few things that I feel really proud of having done there. During the short time I was there, I was the Jewish studies principal. I worked really hard to introduce an 8th grade trip to Israel.
Oh, nice.
And it started when I was there, and I believe it still continues. And I felt really strongly that for kids coming from such a small community and so many different backgrounds, that the one thing that could really unite them is a shared experience in Israel. And it has. Kids who have gone on that trip have continued to be very tied, not just to Israel, but to their Judaism and also to each other as a
That's nice.
class. And so it was really powerful and impactful.
Were you a no-nonsense principal?
I was really funny,
Okay.
and kids liked me. The only student I think in the whole school who really didn't like me was my son, who was in 1st grade. And he's the kind of kid, even now at age 25, he's very easily embarrassed by anything. And anytime I would get up and do my shtick, you could see him just melting.
That sounds likely. That's when
Yeah, it was
that's when he's
very
supposed to do it more. Yes.
Exactly. It was really problematic because I could never, I would be the go-to substitute teacher for any of the Jewish studies teachers, but I could never go. His teacher happened to be quite ill that year, and I could never go in to substitute because it would just embarrass him too much. So we had to always finagle ways for me to go into 5th grade, and then the 5th grade teacher will go into the 1st grade, and you know,
I,
uh,
I was at a charter school where they
ruin his
put my
life.
daughter in my class one time, and she was not happy. She was
Really? Yeah.
happy with that. So what made you decide to move to Israel to begin with?
Uh, a really interesting question. I always had in the back of my mind, I had those experiences of coming to Israel as a kid and then during college where it just felt like there was no place I ever felt as home as when I was in Israel. I also, because I grew up in Los Angeles and because I grew up with a mother who was essentially had been a refugee, um, uh, and she was older by the time I came around, so she wasn't as used to having kids, and she was so frightened about the world. I had a very overprotective mother, and I think there was a sense of freedom whenever I came to Israel, like I could just be myself. And I
Hmm.
always thought that would be a great place to raise kids, great place to raise kids. And then when my husband Daniel and I got married, one of the things we had been friends, Daniel also went to Princeton and to Harvard. So we had
Hmm.
been friends for a long time by the time we started going out and then when we got married. And he was always a Zionist and he always felt very comfortable in Israel and had spent summers there and different experiences. Um, and he, a combination of me running away from overprotectiveness and feeling like I'd love to raise my kids in a place where they could just take buses, take trains, feel at home, feel protected. It's such an ironic thing to say, right? Because
Right.
most people think of Israel as a very dangerous place. But essentially for the kid experience in Israel, people really take care of each other. And that goes across the board, by the way, with is between Jews, Arabs, and
Yeah.
everything else. Like citizens of Israel take care of each other. And a lot of those stories have come up in October 7th. My kids, I've asked them numerous times, I check their pulse. My kids are a little bit older now. My oldest is 25 and my youngest is 16. And I sometimes say to them, you see what your life could have been like had we stayed.
Yeah.
They probably would have, with all of our fancy degrees, they probably would have gone to an Ivy League school or had opportunities that they will never have here. So every once in a while, I've checked their pulse and said, when you look at your parallel life, what are your regrets, or what do you feel like is missing, and what do you feel has been wonderful? And they've never had regrets. We've had regrets sometimes just in terms of their education, but they've never had regrets. And especially after October 7th,
Mhm.
and especially seeing things happening on campuses. And they're good friends with a lot of people who are on US campuses now, like a lot of their
Yeah.
friends from their different programs. And they said, like, we can't ever imagine not being in a place where everybody cares about each other and everybody's looking out for each other, and they all feel safe. They feel scared sometimes, but they feel safe.
I think first of all, I think the Jewish community in general has come closer together since October 7th. I mean, that's definitely how I feel. I see it on like I'm on Twitter. Like I never posted things like political things, and now it's like nonstop, and just talking about this stuff. And I feel all the accounts support each other over there too, and I feel it. But what you just said strikes me is because I'm always worried about what's going on in Israel. Like I told you, I'm always checking, and people in Israel check in with me to see how things are going here in the States. They're worried about that. So it is ironic in a way because of that.
It's
So
really interesting where we find ourselves in the same situation.
yeah,
But as the Jewish community has come closer together, I also feel like there's been a real, over the last few years, but it's been accelerated since October 7th. There's also a divergence between the Israeli community and the North American
yes,
community.
yeah. We'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, I see that too, and I do think I see some, not enough, but a lot of American Jews waking up to what the reality is instead of what in their mind it is. But I do see some waking up, but it's not enough to me. It's still not enough, but hopefully there will be more. I've talked to people, through the Whisper Network about things in general, and who stands with the Jews, and that's to me what you have to look at: who's standing with the Jews, and who's not.
Absolutely.
So now I want to go back to how did you wind up? We talked about the museum a little bit already that you worked there, which is still find fascinating. How did you first come to PJ?
Oh, um, yeah. So it's sort of miraculous the way that I was able to come to PJ Library. I didn't know what PJ Library was exactly.
Hmm.
When we left to move to Israel, um, PJ Li I believe, I can't remember who it was now, but I was still principal of this day school, and someone who knew one of our teachers had come to talk to me about PJ Library, and they came with children's books, and it was just when it was just getting started with just a few hundred families. So I'd heard of it before I left to Israel, and I thought that it was a
Well,
really
also,
interesting.
could you also tell a little bit for those who don't know? Can you tell what PJ's mission is?
Yes, so PJ Library's mission is to spread Jewish joy to families by sending them a Jewish children's picture book every month, from birth through age 12. Obviously,
Mhm.
as they get older, it turns into middle grade books. And to also just support families who are raising Jewish children through books and through other educational and fun activities that are created around the books, social media posts, how to engagement items that come in the mail, for instance, how to bless your children on Friday night, how to say the traveler's prayer with luggage tags. PJ Library has a team of people who are just so creative and think about ways to take the experience beyond the books. And it's all the inspiration of Harold Greenspoon, who's a very successful real estate entrepreneur, who's now in his mid-90s. He should live to 120,
Yes.
and very involved and very with it. And when he was getting more into Jewish philanthropy, he'd always been a philanthropist, but when he was getting more into Jewish philanthropy, his inspiration really was trying to do something to help ensure the future of the Jewish community in North America. And he was at the Seder of his daughter-in-law, of his son and daughter-in-law, who at the time had little children. His daughter-in-law is Winnie Sandler Greenspoon, who's now the president of PJ Library. And at the time, during the Seder, she pulled out some board books and picture books about Passover for her kids to stay engaged and to stay awake during the Seder. And the story is that Harold was just amazed. He had no idea that there were Jewish picture books. And he was a supporter of Dolly Parton's Inspiration Library, because he really saw the value in reading to your children. And he himself had struggled with dyslexia as a kid, and he really and sort of not always finding school to be the easiest thing, but that connection between parents and children and caretakers and children is so special and powerful. He right away zoned in on it and said, let me see every single Jewish children's book that exists. And there weren't that many.
Right. So how did you wind up at PJ?
What?
So how did you wind up at PJ?
So I was at the time, at the time I was working at the museum, but right before then I had written a curriculum for the Melton program, the adult mini school from the Melton Foundation. I had written one of their curricula aimed towards Jewish parents raising Jewish children. And I'd written this whole curriculum, and it was in a lot of different cities in the US. And the person who had started that program was friendly with Harold, and Harold was coming to visit Israel. And this person, Jonathan Rosen, he called me and he said, Harold Greenspoon wants to meet you. And I said, why? And he said, I don't know, but when Harold Greenspoon says he wants to meet you, you go and meet him.
You meet Harold.
And so I was thinking, okay, what is this about? I have no idea. Let me do my homework. So I went, this is, so many years ago. This is like, this is 13 years ago, 12 years ago. I started looking online and I saw how much PJ Library had grown. And I looked and saw how many cities PJ Library was available in. But the one thing that really struck out for me of everything that I saw on the website was that it was very young child centered, and it stopped at age 8. And as a Jewish educator, at that point, I sort of considered myself a Jewish educator. I'm thinking to myself, well, what about stopping at age 12 or 13? Like, we have this big thing called a bar mitzvah. Why would you stop at age 8? That makes no sense, So why wouldn't you carry a family through until they got to that age? So I wrote a whole proposal about how you could expand PJ Library. And I came to the meeting in the lobby of the Sheraton Hotel in Tel Aviv with this proposal in my back pocket. And I didn't know Harold well enough at the time to know that you don't make like these long-winded proposals. I just, wrote it all out. And we sat down together, and he said to me, what would you do to expand PJ Library beyond age 8? And I said, funny you should ask. And I showed him my proposal. And we were kind of in sync. And that's how it started.
Amazing. And what were your responsibilities once you got there?
first I was a consultant, and then he hired me full time to figure out how to expand PJ Library. It was Winnie who came up with the title PJ Our Way, and it was an inopportune Shabbat. It was meant to be an ebook program originally, because we didn't know how to. We knew that we had to give kids choice in the books that they chose and the books they were reading. An 8-year-old and a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old is not the same as a 3-year-old. You can't just pull them onto your lap and say, we're reading this together. You have to give them some choice. And so it felt like the best way to give kids choice was to use ebooks. After I'd been working with Harold at PJ Library for about a year and a half, he came again to Israel. He used to come to Israel quite a bit. Now he doesn't travel as much, but he used to come to Israel at least once a year. And so I hosted him at my house for Friday night dinner. He and his entourage, some really nice people, came for Friday night dinner, for Shabbat dinner. And my now 22-year-old at the time was 10. And she had read, she was a voracious reader, not like I was as a kid. She was really a voracious reader. She now studies philosophy for her undergraduate degree. So that makes a lot of sense. And she came down with her whole stack of books that I'd had her read for the program. She was my kid reader. And he wanted to hear about every single book. Harold wanted to hear about every single book. And then he turned to her and he said, do you like reading books? I see all these books are in print. Do you prefer reading printed books or ebooks? And she said, oh, printed books. I hate ebooks. And he said, why? And she said, well, I like to look at a bookshelf and see everything I've read. Yeah. And I like to be able to read on Shabbat, and I like to be able to carry a book with me wherever I go. And I don't want to have to worry about plugging in somewhere. I just want my book. And that was the end of the ebook program.
Your daughter's responsible for everything.
You can't let your kids do anything, really.
So what went into the decision? I know a lot of people always ask this. What goes into this decision, or went into the decision, which books would be would PJ Book would be selected for PJ Book? I mean, what criteria was used? Was it a committee, or did one person have most of the decision-making power?
So it's really based on committee for both PJ Library and PJ Our Way and Sifri Apajama here in Israel. All three of those programs work decision based on committee. For the rest of the world, they work for all the other programs where PJ Library is located, another 20 countries or more. They work based on a curated list of the books that are already available either in Hebrew or in English. And then they translate them, of course. But they also have committees, but they already work on a curated limited list. Whereas PJ Our Way, PJ Library, and Sifri Pajama, which is the Israeli program in Hebrew, and Maktabat al-Fanus, which is the Arabic program. But there isn't a lot of crossover between the Arabic program and the other programs because they don't have Jewish content in their books. There's some crossover, but not a huge amount. Basically, there's the way it works is either an author will send, the committee head will submit a manuscript, or their agent will submit the manuscript, or a publisher will submit a manuscript, or we have roving committee members who will just scour and scour and scour library lists, publishing lists, backlists, out of print lists to look for ideas of books that maybe were published 30, 40 years ago, and maybe we know who the rights belong to, and then it can be edited and spruced up for today's kids. And so books are submitted in this way. Both committees have a pre-committee that basically reads everything that comes in. Every single book, every single manuscript, every single idea is first vetted. And once a book, the only criteria is that this vetting committee feels that the book has potential, and then it gets pushed into it gets passed on to the selection committee. And then the selection committee makes the determination about whether the book would work for the program. Then all sorts of other considerations come into play. How much is the book? Can it be printed paperback? Can it be printed, in the quantities that we need? All of those things are not up to the committee. The committee just sends their list. They say, okay, these are the books that will
We think
work.
this is a good idea if you want to go
Yeah.
forward. Right.
And then, some meanie and publishing will say, no, it's gonna, we can't afford it. It doesn't meet our budget, whatever it is, But most of the time, not most of it, the majority of cases, the book will end up in the program if it passes through all those stages.
And publishers want to work with PJ because it guarantees them a certain amount.
That they consider PJ to be gravy in many respects.
Right.
It's more that they've gotten used to working with us, or us. I'm retired now with them. Right. They've gotten used to working with PJ Library. PJ Library has excellent relationship with every single publisher that you can imagine. I think, except for every single Jewish publisher and all of the major big 5 publishers, and then a lot of mid-tier publishers as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, for anyone listening or watching, I do encourage authors to get involved with PJ. It's such a wonderful program and very good to me, and that's why I met you through that. And
we met in Israel.
Yes, and the Israel trip really changed my life in a lot of ways. It was very eye-opening for me. So
how so?
It was because I think I was there as a kid. I lived there as a kid, and in Israel for a couple of years, and I had not gone back. So I got to experience it through an adult lens, and I really felt walking around the connection that you don't think about as a kid. And it was nice to get to see, hey, this person's Jewish, that person's Jewish, just walking around. You don't think about, over here, you feel like the other in some capacity, and there you did not. You felt home. And it's cliche, but I really felt that you walk places that you think, hey, other Jews were here thousands of years ago too. And so it really felt connected in a way that I had not as a kid. So that made me feel closer to Israel. It opened my eyes in a new way, seeing it through an adult lens, which was fantastic.
I remember, our discussions, our conversations, and then later you were on the tent program.
Yes.
And so it was really great to be able to see you in Israel, and then to see you after, and then the other times when we've been able to catch up, because it's really stayed with you. And really I think it's one of the most, because then I became in charge of author stewardship, which is just really finding opportunities to grow the PJ Library network of authors. And Israel, the Israel experience was by far the most powerful. Mm-hmm. All of it was powerful, but there's nothing can compare with bringing colleagues, bringing co-creator, creators together and letting them experience that together with all of their varied backgrounds and all of their varied perspectives. And I don't know about you, I know from talking to other authors who have come to Israel with PJ Library, they continue with their connections with each other.
Yes, look, I can't say everyone, but yes, but many of the people that were on my trip, I still keep in contact with, and I do feel that connect. You have that link. It feels, yes. You do have that eternal link now that we experienced that together. So yes, yep. for sure. Now I do want to ask you now, while you were there, and I don't know if you want to answer this or willing to discuss this aspect, but I've spoken to many other Jewish authors, and there seems to be this feeling that the criteria used in regular publishing houses was much tougher to acquiring Jewish-themed books than non-Jewish content. And this was even before October 7th. Now I think it's even more so. Did you experience that at all?
Well, I didn't personally experience it. I'm not an author. I know, that there were rumblings about that. I really can't, I don't have enough personal experience to really say, because publishing works pretty slowly. And in general, yes. there weren't any books that PJ Library or PJ Arway was interested in offering, that for any reason I ever heard that, a publisher or an editor said, we just can't work on this book now. We can't work on this book now. So, we were, in fact, in the middle grade program, PJ Arway, over half of the manuscripts that we would receive came from major non-Jewish publishers, where they were sending us manuscripts of books that they had already contracted out to print.
Yeah, I mean, early on in my writing career, I mean, I was explicitly told by an agent that one of my stories was too Jewish. So it's and this was a story about a golem. So and I'm not alone in that, because other authors that I know have experienced the same thing. So, and I know that there have been Jewish stories published. I know there have even been golem stories published, but it always feels like that it's much tougher to get across the finish line. And that's just maybe it's we're looking at it too much, but especially now, I think since October 7th, it seems even more so that there the whisper networks going on, that and you see people on lists, on like the Zionist lists now, and I've heard from people who I trust very much that editors are scared to publish, be connected to publishing Jewish content.
I'm not surprised to hear it. I just didn't experience it. And, I retired from PJ Library just before Passover, and it wasn't something that like those lists came out after, and I did see them. I saw, again, whispering of them, and I saw some outright articles where people have been talking about how difficult the publishing world has been, just like every single aspect of creativity. And, listen, you see it in the high-tech world.
Sure.
I don't think there's a single profession that has not been touched by what's been happening, and it's really, really frightening. I would encourage authors who are interested in publishing Jewish content, and I say that deliberately. I always would change the language, because a lot of authors, there are authors out there who are very talented, who want to write Jewish stories, who aren't Jewish. And I never felt that there was, a book is either authentic or it's not authentic. It either sounds authentic or it's not authentic. And personally, one of the things that we do in reviewing, or they do in reviewing books at PJ Library and PJ Arway, is that all books are read anonymously to begin with. And I think that that's a fair way of doing things, because you need to know, someone could have grown up in Brooklyn and had all the experiences of their life, but the book doesn't end up sounding like a own voices, authentic type of book. Whereas someone who's not Jewish, who maybe just had some experience or did their research, can get that voice right. So I always say authors who are interested in publishing Jewish children's books, the first thing I would really, really recommend is I think that there's always been authors who are interested in Jewish content kind of coming together in critique groups and networks. And I think that that's really, really important, because I think there's so much wisdom, both in terms of the quality of writing to be shared, but also in terms of wisdom of experience. Because people can, when they come together, they can share stories like you just shared. If you're in a critique group, then you can say, hey, this is what I was told. What do you think of that? Oh, I've never been told that. Maybe you should try this agent, or you should try this editor. And there's a lot of wisdom that can be shared through those kinds of networks without it going on social media. I mean, just like face-to-face type of critique groups. There are plenty of editors out there who are Jewish and who are also are proudly Jewish and who are interested in publishing Jewish books. Before I left PJ Library, we had hosted a webinar with Arthur Levine and Barbara Marcus and editors from different houses, and of course the Jewish publishing houses as well. And there is, they say there's interest, and they say there's an avenue for publishing. PJ Library, even if PJ Library is not bringing in the big bucks to a publisher, what PJ Library is successful at doing um, is promoting a title. So if the argument can be made, here's a book that's going to end up in the PJ Library lineup. So a publisher may be not getting the highest revenue on those books because of the wholesale pricing, but at the same time, you've got 20,000 families who are holding this book in their hands. That's got to help in terms of promotion and marketing. And so when you have that audience, like, take advantage of it.
One of the things I told you before we came on, I've done a few of these now, and I always talk about the double standard with Jewish books. That a couple of weeks ago, I had on Debbie Reed Fisher here, another author, and we were talking about the same thing. I did that Jewish anthology.
Abby Show, right? The Abby Show.
Yes, the Abby Show. But she was involved in the coming of age, the Jewish anthology story that I put together. So Kirkus gave it a review that said, non-Jewish kids wouldn't be interested. They would never have used that review on any other minority. They would say, if there was a book for Black History Month, they would never say it. A Muslim anthology, they would never have said that. But the Jewish one, they felt comfortable enough to say that. So there is a huge, still to me, double standard between Jewish books and others.
Absolutely. It starts, with the protests, and, everybody has a right to protest. I don't even know if everybody has a right to protest, but everybody has a right to protest. But where were they when every other war and tragedy and is happening around the world? Like, their silence is deafening. It's just unbelievable.
Well, we talked about this too. I'm going to get, the protests. You protest all you want, but at a certain point, you hear what's being said, you hear the word being said, and if you decide to still stay there, now you're complicit. When you're saying, kill all the Jews, and you're still there, that's it. You've lost your credibility to protest.
By any means possible. Yes.
All right. Well, you mentioned leaving PJ, so when I saw your email you sent out to all your friends and everything, I was stunned. So what made you decide to leave PJ?
It really was an after effect of the war. First of all, I had a really, really nice career at PJ Library, 12 years. It was a long time. And I had personally moved on from PJ Our Way in terms of, I'd been with I was the founding director. I'd been with PJ Our Way for 10 years. And it felt like it needed a new perspective. One of the advantages I had when I first started really developing PJ Our Way is I had 4 kids who were more or less in that age range. And now my youngest, when I realized that she, like a couple of years ago, when she turned 14, I realized I don't have any kids in this age range anymore. Not only that, I've raised my kids more in Israel than I've raised them in America. And it just also felt like I personally, I don't want to say losing touch. I just, different, my personal values have shifted from the typical American value system of a family raising Jewish kids. And that's what I talked about, like the divergence in communities. I felt that just, on just trying to balance my life, my work life, with the time zone issue, but also since the war, I have found on a personal level that my children, who are really kind of more towards the adult range than the kid range, have needed their parents more than ever before. I mean, the things that they're experiencing on a daily basis, you and I were so sheltered from that kind of experience. One of my daughter's best friends was killed on October 8th, the day that he went in to fight. Her closest friends are constantly going back to Gaza, like they think that, or Gaza, they think that they've been released from reserve duty. They finally get back into school and they're called up again, and they're in dangerous, dangerous situations all the time. And the amount of worry that they have for that situation is really very high. I have another daughter who's in the spokesperson's unit, which is wonderful. We're so proud of her, but it's very, very stressful. And, with her managing that, and then just day to day, just the trying to keep things together. And I just felt like my priorities, I'm a workaholic. It's really always been very difficult for me to find that work-life balance. And it felt strange to be committing so many hours in my day and in my week and in my life to the American Jewish community when there's so much that has to be done here, both on a personal level, on my community level, and then on the larger Israel level. And so it just sort of became very obvious that it was
You
time.
mentioned that you had goals to that effect about doing something for Israel or for Jews over there. So what do you have planned next? Do you have anything that you have set up yet or thoughts about?
Yeah. So the first thing I did is, just looking at what's happening. I felt like I'm not speaking enough Hebrew, and I'm not, the economy is kind of going down the tubes, and what can I do? So the first thing I did was I bought us an imported Sundance jacuzzi hot tub. So I had to deal with lots of teams in Hebrew, and I gave a real big boost to the Israeli economy on many levels, and so I felt really proud of that. So that was all of a sudden I realized, I've always wanted a hot tub, and now we're going to do it because I actually have time to do it. But on a more serious level, I went right back into teaching, which is what I love.
Did you? Okay.
I taught a limited course on Rabbi Akiva, and it was a difficult subject to address, and I kept trying to avoid it, which is this period of time between the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 and the quashing of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135. And it's a really, really difficult time to teach, but I wanted to teach about because it's so, it's a little too on the nose. But I felt it was important to just air it out. The time between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot is called the Omer, and had agricultural roots. But Rabbi Akiva was said that 24,000 of his students died during that period from a plague. But when you dig down into the surface, it becomes clear that they were either fighting in the revolt or they were killed because a lot of Jews were killed in this area during that time. And that there was a little bit of self-censorship in the Talmud about it. So I wanted to dig deeper, like who was Rabbi Akiva? What happened? Who were his students? What was happening at the time? And it wasn't easy, but the students I had here and where, I was running 2 classes on it, and in 2 different places. And it was really good for me to be able to devote so much time. And I've been teaching other classes also and other one-offs. And that's been really good. And just, I have dreams of a nonprofit I want to start, but that's
what I know that you had mentioned that. So do you have something that you have in mind right now?
I do, and I can say it because I hope that we can get enough people to get on board. It really was inspired by the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel protests on university campuses, because I thought of my own university experience, and I thought, wow, that's really not worth $80,000 to go onto campus and have to run into a hillel and barricade yourself inside. And I thought, every single world survey of universities has Israeli universities always listed in the top 50, in the top 100, in the top 500. Every single Israeli university ends up, relatively speaking, high on the list. And so what can we do to make Israel a more safe, welcoming, cheap place for American kids to be able to come and get their education without having to worry about demonstrations of that scale.
Yeah.
There are demonstrations in Israel too, by the way, but nobody feels like they're anti-Jewish.
Right.
But what can we do to do that? And just in thinking about it, I realized the core of the problem isn't so much how to market to American Jewish kids. The core of the problem is really trying to figure out how to get Israeli academics back to Israel. Israel is facing the threat of a huge brain drain. It's been happening for years and years and years for a lot of different reasons. But how do you, especially now when Israeli academics
stay.
Yes, exactly. Entice them to stay and entice them to come back.
Well, I hope this goes. I'd love to hear more about this as you go through it, and when you do, love to speak to you again about that. But so how can people, if people do want to get involved in some capacity, or maybe to help in Israel, to volunteer right now, so what can be done and what do you suggest?
Oh, so I don't have anything started yet. The real thing, what's ended up happening to me is I've ended up, in a very selfish way, I also have a book that I'm writing
Nice.
On Jewish academic topics.
Okay.
And it's been really fun to just kind of sort of become more selfish, internal, and just think about these ideas. And that's been, making me smile. So I don't have anything specific, happening right now, but there are a myriad ways for people to volunteer, and it really depends on I think that the best way for them, if they want to hear more from me about things that can happen, of things they can do, is to get in touch with you, and you can do some weeding out and see what people really want to be doing, and then I can always help place them. There are so many groups coming to Israel now. Momentum has started up again. Birthright, I know, has been coming again. It really depends on what area people want to volunteer in or want to contribute in. My
daughter's going there soon, actually, too. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's right. When is she?
My daughter's going there after the summer for the year.
And this is like this is post high school.
Yes.
That's wonderful. So you're going to have to come and visit me.
I'm going to have to do that. Yes. Much to her chagrin. So.
We won't tell her you're here.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, continue. So what else can people do then? Yeah.
Oh yeah. So there, people don't like to talk about it because it makes them feel uncomfortable, but militarily, I hear about army units all the time that, there's an infinite number of needs in the army and limited capacity and limited resources. And, obviously Israeli parents feel very nervous when their kids are going into combat and don't have the equipment
that
they need. And it can be very scary situation. You never want to think about it because you say, wow, the IDF is the most powerful, resourceful army in the world. And it is, I think, except when it's fighting two major wars, three wars, by the way. There's the Northern Front, there's the Gaza front, and there's also the West Bank and things that are happening there too. So it's the army is stretched. And, I just was talking to a really close friend who was saying, her son goes in with his comrades into these places in Gaza with no overhead protection. And there's booby traps, there's urban warfare, there's human shields, and they have no overhead protection. And she's crying every single night because she doesn't know, she feels like if only she could raise, $50,000 to make sure that they had some sort of, but, parents can't do that. And so I think that it is something for people to realize that is, if they find a place. I know there's an organization called Think Israeli Soldiers, and started by someone who had been in the aircraft industry, I believe. And he's been doing a lot to help soldiers themselves, like help make sure that they have what they need to feel like they can fight and feel like they can protect themselves.
That's good. I'm going to try to put some links down when I post this. But Catriella, no, I want to thank you again for coming today and speaking. It's always, first of all, it's always a treat to speak to you anyway. So, but I thank you for coming on to do this officially.
Likewise, Jonathan. I'm so thankful to you for inviting me, and also for making sure that the two of us over the last few years always have time to speak every few months. It's been great.
Yes,
You know,
I always look forward. But again, this has been Did You Know? I'm Jonathan Rosen, and again, a very special thanks to Catriella Freedman. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to The Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.